Hey everyone. I was asked to do or at least I was asked what someone can take if they're about to go through medications for cancer and how to detoxify that. So I thought I'd have a quick chat about cancer and how it develops. And I thought I would just read this. So one of my good friends, Dr. John Ryan, so he's been a functional medicine doctor here in Brisbane, Australia for over 50 years, and this is his new book. So, 50 years of research and anecdotal, but he's very much a doctor. But he actually allowed my auntie, who was going to be dead by the time she was 50, she ended up dying at like 87 years old a couple of years ago, because at the time she was on many medications for epilepsy, and he started giving her vitamin boosters and started looking at the underlying causes, which was inflammation and toxicity, and started to help her to heal. So she ended up living an extra 35 years or something once she started seeing him, whereas the doctors had sort of thrown their hands up and said nothing else we can do, which is all good. It's good if doctors actually admit that not their specialty. Wearing my green glasses today for St. Paddy's Day. Anyway, so I thought I would read this because it might not be something that has been uncovered to you in your research. Every cell in your body contains genes with instructions on how it should operate. Each gene contains about 1,700 building blocks, known as nucleotides, and every second, about 50 of these nucleotides replicate themselves. Not surprisingly, mistakes sometimes happen in that replication process, whether by chance or due to a virus, chemicals, radiation, or external factors. A gene mutation is more likely if you have a family history of a particular cancer, best known as the BRCA gene mutation, where people are most likely to develop breast cancer. Men with BRCA mutations also have a higher than average lifetime risk for breast cancer, prostate cancer, and other cancers. About 10% of all cancers are thought to develop because of inherited gene mutations, but the gene mutations behind the remaining 90% of cancer are believed to be triggered by environmental and lifestyle factors. I've actually heard that up to 99%. So, somewhere we know that genetic is somewhere between 1 and 10%. So if you go, oh, my mum had breast cancer, I'm going to get breast cancer, that's only 10% of the equation, maximum. Childhood cancers are different from those in adults and not due as much to lifestyle factors. Cancer causes in children are commonly linked to gene mutations, toxins, environmental factors, and are more often related to cancers of the blood, lymph, brain, bone, and liver. Once a gene mutates, the cell is left without the instructions it needs to grow and reproduce in an orderly way. So that's when the cancer takes over. And in fact, if you think about how cancers are different from normal cells, they replicate endlessly. So by this stage, our tumor necrosing genes have been switched off. They avoid normal programmed cell death. They grow blood vessels to supply nutrients. Yeah, and that's one of the things I've found with a lot of things like fibroids and cysts over the years as well, that once we have a fibroid or a cyst or a non-cancerous tumour anywhere in the body, it often has its own blood supply which keeps feeding itself. So you can be getting blood tests and not be finding these things. They change genetically to adapt to the environment where the need arises. They invade other organs and form tumours elsewhere in the body. They promote tumours through inflammation. They reprogram their energy supply to meet demand. For example, they supply glucose at 20 times the rate of normal cells. So basically, that's the sort of in behind cancer and the triggers within the World Health Organization. They divide cancer-causing agents. So even though doctors always say, we don't know, there's crapload they do know. So they know that physical carcinogens, such as ultraviolet light, ionizing radiation, anything that creates radiation in the environment, can be cancer-forming. Biological carcinogens, such as viral, bacterial, parasitic infections, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of manipulated viruses and bacteria out there in the form of genetic modified organisms as well. Chemical carcinogens such as tobacco smoke, pesticides, and asbestos. And of course, in the past, lots of stuff like lead in our petrol and DDT and all sorts of things like that. endocrine disruptors, man-made chemicals that interfere with our body hormones. Now, what's sort of funny with that is that you can imagine over the last 100 years, lots and lots of medications have been used for lots of things. And I was at a congress on cancer a few years ago, and they were particularly talking about BPA, so BPA, bisphenol A. So these days you get like non-BPA plastic, but there's many other bisphenols, like many other letters of the alphabet. Now, BPA was actually used in the late 1800s and early 1900s before they started creating synthetic estradiol, can't remember which one, but basically they created a synthetic estrogen, and BPA was already known to change women's hormones by that stage. So then in the 60s, of course, BPA just became ubiquitous. They used it in plastic everywhere. So here we were eating out of plastic containers and using Glad wrap to wrap everything and getting water bottles for our kids. And, plastic is so ubiquitous these days. And regardless of the type of plastic, they are still endocrine disruptors when they're getting into our foods. And that is anything that creates an endocrine disruption can mess with your hormones. If it messes with your hormones, it can create chronic illness down the track if we're unlucky enough for that to switch on our inflammatory genes and switch off our tumor necrosing genes and our healthy genes. So basically, so that's sort of like the cancer triggers as per the World Health Organization. So with things like physical carcinogens, UV rays and radiation, it's sort of everywhere. It's sort of like stuff like the X-rays, radiotherapy, CT scans, all of MRIs, all of those have some level of radiation associated with them. And when researchers predicted 39 cancers would develop in the next 10 years per 10,000 children exposed to CT scans. So how many kids are getting scans and things these days, and they know that we're going to be getting 40% higher levels of things going on? So there's so many iPads, there's laptops, there's computer sort of stuff that we're in front of all the time. Do you have things on your phones, on your computers to protect? Around your computer, you can have things like, little jars of Epsom salts or peace lilies, or, there's lots of crystals and things that you can have around so that can help to sop up the radiation. I've got the Tesla, so looking at the Tesla products that help to, just change the frequency so that they're less toxic, less problematic for people. So there's so much you can do in your house that can help to keep you healthier. But once your genes have actually triggered, that's a much harder job turning it around. And once you've had chemo and radiation, it's a much harder job to turn it around because you've just added a huge amount more chemicals into your system. And once again, that frequency of fear, the frequency of survival will make you go, yep, I've got to do what I've got to do, what I've got to do. But I did listen to one oncologist naturopath a few years ago, and she got breast cancer. She had a really dodgy, I think she had the MTHFR gene, which gave her which was linked to a couple of her children being on the spectrum. And she also had high levels of cryptopyrroles, and there were a few things going on. But when she did her genetic testing, she found that a lot of her inflammatory markers were very high, and her genes for anti-inflammation just weren't working very well. So there's a lot of these things that we can do in a preemptive stage before we get cancer. But, there's been DDT on the planet for so long, and whether or not that stimulated the production of polio, because, DDT and polio happened around the same time. So toxins can mess with your immune system, which can mess with your ability to fight infections and therefore create long-term disease, because infections, if we fight an infection naturally, then we've got immunity for life. So when you get an infection isn't a disease. The disease is what happens long-term that can really mess with our ability to live our life on the planet with ease and grace and in a pain-free manner. So by the time we've got a disease, something's gone wrong with our genetics and can preempt, because cancer's obviously the big one, but the sort of things that are on the cancer watch list, and these are the things to try to, look for in your house and get rid of them so that you're living at least in an environment within your space. So things like PCB, polychlorinated bisphenol. It's found in paints, plastics, rubber, dyes, motor oil, tapes and floor finishes. So every time you do some renovations to your house, you may be adding more toxins. So I've built a couple of clinics in the past, and each time I always use the lowest VOC paints. I always use the carpets that have the least VOCs. I always used water-based glues. So there's lots of things that I've been aware of for a long time that I always do. There's PBDEs, that's polybrominated diphenyl ethers, found in flame retardants, electronics, furnitures and textiles. So that's the sort of thing that can also be in stuff like Teflon pans and that type of thing, because they can be a real issue. Dioxins. Dioxins are created by the burning of wood, forest fires, incineration, smelting, chlorine bleaching of paper pulp, and manufacture of some herbicides and pesticides. And there's a lot of dioxins in our water supply, which is another one of those reasons why we need to use a filter on your water. Get the best filter you can afford, and ask lots and lots of questions. What does it remove? Have there been studies? Does it remove the fluoride? Does it remove the chlorine? Does it remove the dioxins? There was a funny story going back. It wasn't that funny actually, but there were a couple of researchers in Canada, and they were trying to find a population of people who were not on cholesterol drugs or heart drugs. And rather than just trusting the people that weren't on cholesterol drugs or heart drugs, because what they wanted to do was check the microbiome of those people, so check the gut bugs and see whether it was different in people with heart disease and high cholesterol compared to those who did not have high cholesterol and heart disease. So what they were doing was checking the urine samples of those people to see if there was any of the drugs for those conditions in their urine. And they couldn't actually find anyone in Canada that didn't have them in. So what they ended up doing was going to the water source, and there was so much drug residue in the water source that people drinking normal tap water were just basically getting some residue of these drugs anyway. So that's why, water filtration is really important, because this can be messing with our genes, adding to our toxic load, making it one more thing our body is having to deal with, whereas we shouldn't be dealing with someone else's drug residue. Bisphenol A. So that's an endocrine disrupting chemical found in plastics and resins, water bottles and other containers, including epoxy resins lining cans. So, sometimes we're buying cans, that resin inside, or any of our tinned foods and that sort of thing. And then the acid, just say you're buying organic tomato sauce, but it's in a tin, the epoxy resin and that BPA on the inside, that can get through into your thing. So all of a sudden your organic tomatoes, they're not organic anymore. Yeah, organochlorine pesticides. That's pesticides include DDT, dieldrin, and chlordane. So phthalates found in plastics and furnishing, floorings, toys, cleaning agents, cosmetics, hairsprays, and perfumes. They can leach into fatty foods if microwaved, or leach into foods from the PVC labels. So once again, using glass where you can for cooking, using substances that don't have that Teflon coating, because all of these can leach in. Parabens, which are in the hydroxybenzoates, antifungal preservatives that are used to inhibit bacteria and make products last longer, found in cosmetics, shampoos, sunscreens, and some foods and beverages, and are linked to breast cancer. Now, I did see a study going back, it was maybe 12 months ago, and there are definitely things in our hair products that get into the breast tissue. So they found that women who have hair dye every 4 to 6 weeks had twice the amount of cancer as those who didn't. So, once again, our hair dyes and things go to someone who is more aware of those things. And if you choose to get your hair dyed, make sure you drink oodles and oodles and oodles and oodles and oodles of water over the next few days, and just really support your liver. And then, of course, there's things like tobacco smoke, pesticides and insecticides, perfluorodactyl. That's a group of man-made chemicals which includes perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, and perfluorooctane sulfonate. It occurs in everything from firefighting foam to non-sticking frying pans, because of the heat-resistant properties. Both PFOA and PFOS have been shown to cause tumours in animals. Now, we had a case here in Australia a couple of years ago where that was used a lot in exercises for the army, and it actually made its way into the water table out near one of our out west towns, and there were people out there getting really unwell. So there was a case against the Australian government and the Australian Defence Force about that, maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago or something. And of course, lead. Lead's hard to avoid, mostly found in old paints, house paints, contaminated soil and batteries. And I certainly know that here in Australia at one stage that we had some paints that our government changed the rules on, and all of a sudden they weren't allowed. So our manufacturers were, of course, allowed to sell them, so they just sold them to some poorer countries, which is, pure evil. Whoever does that sort of thing, once they find a disease associated with or illness, and then they just sell them elsewhere. I just don't think that's right. So that's part one. That's just about, some of the big stuff that can be linked in with. So these are all known carcinogens out there in our environment, out there in our houses. And so every time we make a choice, what choice are we making? So, I sort of think the next one I'll do will be on the actual supplements that I recommend for people. Okay, take care. See you soon.